Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. At the beginning of my speech, I should say welcome to our dear guests and wish have a pleasant days in Iran. The topic of my speech, as Mr. Astghari said, is the rationality in Islamic mysticism. I will start with some introductory notes about Sufism, Islamic mysticism, and its position in the history of Orthodox Islam. I thought we need these introductory notes because there are different ideas concerning what is Sufism and how we can define it and what is its orthodoxy among the other fields of studies in Iran. So I will start with this title. The main topic of these sessions are to consider Islam from different Muslim perspectives. We should thank the organizers of the conference for giving attention to this profound and significant subject. It is a crucial fact that in the course of its history, Islam has never had a single meaning of rationality, nor will it do so in the future. Modern communications and the new concept of Islam as an anti-colonial ideology have made this idea of Muslim unity popular. Thus, non-ideological practices are usually considered as deviations from a homogeneous norm. Yet we must ask who is entitled to decide what Orthodox Islam is. Is it Muslim politicians and ideologists, or formal Muslim authorities such as Sunni and Shiite ulama, or non-Muslims with their positive and negative preconceptions of Islam? At the same time, globalizing communications have opened up the possibility of hearing previously unheard voices, and these are now being heard. We are now able to hear the voices of Muslim minority groups. Here I should directly refer to the Sufi groups or Islamic mysticism. However, it may be surprising if I mention that this minority was once the majority of Muslims. More than 80% of the Muslims all over the world originally became Muslim, not as a result of the cutting sword of rulers such as Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, but because of the heart-attracting words and practices of the mystics such as Mir Sayyid Ali Hamedani, or Maulana Rumi, or Ibn Arabi. Today, the relevance of Sufism to the contemporary situation of Muslims and the catastrophic results of ignoring or rejecting it that modern-day Muslims suffer are undeniable. For a great variety of reasons, people often become suspicious at the mention of Sufism. In Western countries, it is regularly associated with sentimentality and New Ageism. In the Islamic world, over the past century, from one side, there have been Muslim modernists who have taken Sufism as a demonic presence that must be driven out if Islam is to enter the modern world. And from the opposite side, there have been Muslim fundamentalists who consider Sufism as a deviation from Islam. The fact is that modern-day Muslims do not have any idea of the historical role that Sufism has played in the Islamic world. Sufism, as the spiritual essence of Islam, has had a significant presence in all of the theoretical and practical dimensions of Islam. Hence, for example, in both Islamic philosophy and Islamic arts, thoughts of a Sufi character are clearly discernible. In the development of philosophy, from Farabi to Mulla Sadra, almost all philosophers had a Sufi worldview, In Islamic art, Sufism is totally present from architecture and music to calligraphy. Moreover, in Iranian culture, signs of Sufism are present from top to bottom. Now we come to the question, what is it? What is it, Sufism? And how is it related to Islam? Sufism is the spiritual dimension of Islam. Many Orientalists and historians of Islam think that Sufism is a sect that appeared relatively late in the history of Islam. This view is a result of the fact that they focus on written works and consider the appearance of the term Sufism to mark its inception. Or they imagine that Islam is confined to jurisprudential precepts and conclude that Sufism must be something foreign to Islam. However, if we pay close attention to the teachings and sayings of the Sufis, we will find that Sufism is a title that has been given to the spiritual aspect of Islam, following a kind of spirituality, but whose truth is rooted in the very core of Islam itself. Historically speaking, Sufis are not regarded as forming a separate sect in Islam, nor do they claim to be such. They can be found within the major Islamic schools and denominations, and the bridge between them. According to a division made by the Sufis, Islam has two aspects: the outward aspect, which includes the Sharia, the precepts of Islamic law, and the inward aspect called tariqah, the spiritual way. Together, these aspects lead to haqiqah, the truth. Sufism is another term for the spiritual way. In Arabic and Persian, when the word tariqah is mentioned, it usually refers to Sufi way. However, we should avoid calling Sufism Islamic mysticism. I have mentioned also Islamic mysticism because some people do it, and if you read the book by Shimel, you will find his name. The name of the book, it's the Islamic dimensions, mystical dimensions of Islam. We should avoid calling Sufism Islamic mysticism because of the passive and anti-intellectual color that this word has come to possess in most contemporary European languages, as a result of several centuries of struggle between Christianity and rationalism. And this is a crucial point in my speech. It is likely that because mysticism deals with what lies beyond rationality, popular culture identifies mysticism with magic and occult powers. In contrast to this, Sufism is an active participation in a spiritual path and is intellectual in the true sense of this word. As mentioned, Sufism is the inner path of Islam. It is concerned more with the spiritual objectives of Islam than the laws related to Islamic jurisprudence, Sharia. Sufis agreed with the ulama, or Islamic jurisprudence, that is Sharia, or the body of Islamic law, is based upon a series of realities and beneficial objectives. But these two groups disagree with each other, that ulama believe that the only way of attaining these objectives is to act according with the Sharia, where the Sufis believe that the objectives underlying the law of Sharia also have a spirit and meaning and an intellectuality, the understanding of which is a necessary prerequisite of the human being's ascent towards God and his access to ultimate reality. Thus, Sufis try to understand the wisdom and meaning underlying the precepts of the Sharia and to determine how they can be adapted to the conditions, when we are talking about the modern world, to the conditions of the modern world. According to the words of a great living Sufi, the Sufi is the son of his time, and he can glimpse better than others the result of the divine wisdom in any context whatsoever. Before going any further, I need to state clearly What I mean by the Islamic intellectual tradition in Sufism, since this is the key to what I have tried to do in the present discussion. This intellectuality is a deep current in Islamic thought that goes back to the Quran and the Hadith. What differentiates this tradition from the legalistic approach of the Sharia or Islamic law is that its representatives ask about the why of things, not simply how. In contrast, the jurists who speak for the Sharia are largely concerned with telling people what they must do. They do not ask why such things should be done, since they take for granted the Sharia's basic prescriptions. But no matter how important the Sharia may be for Islamic society, it is built upon principles that transcend itself. This is a fact of which the practitioners of the science known as usul fiqh, it's a common discipline in the Islamic studies, meaning the principles of jurisprudence have always been actually aware. The intellectual tradition has been concerned with exploring these principles in the deepest sense. Once the principles are brought out, they can be applied in novel ways without breaking the spirit or the letter of the Sharia. Without knowledge of the principles, novel approaches can be advanced that observe the Sharia, but all too often these break with its spirit. I will mention an example. The issues raised by the modern concern with the politics of gender, which is now a popular topic in the Islamic world, which is mostly criticized by the anti-Muslims, cannot be addressed, the issues raised by the modern concern, through the Sharia, since the Sharia simply issues commandments. It does not tell us what a woman receives less in inheriting from her parents than her brother does. If someone objects, the answer of the jurist can only be that God has told us to do this way. Nowadays, Muslim apologists also bring forth all sorts of sociological considerations with a view to answering certain Western-inspired objections. But this legal, and sociological approach tells us nothing about the deeper reasons for the Islamic worldview. It is the deeper reasons that the Sufi intellectual tradition addresses. Answers to the question that naturally arise about issues such as gender relationships cannot be found by posing them to those who are unfamiliar with the principles and roots of Islamic thought. Throughout Islamic history, the jurists have been criticized by the great authorities of the Sufi intellectual tradition, such as Ghazali, for their narrow-mindedness, lack of depth, and one-dimensioned approach to the problems that people face as human beings. You can see it in his famous book, Ihya Ulumuddin, especially at the introduction of the book. One of the most unfortunate signs of contemporary malaise of the Islamic world is that the intellectual authorities have all but disappeared from the scene, while the jurists have a free hand to say what they want. There are many reasons for this, not the least of them the fact that Westerners have always considered Orthodox Islam to lie in the Sharia, in spite of the fact that some Western scholars have pointed out that Sharia deals only with orthodoxy, with orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. I mean, fiqh can say about the orthopraxy of Islam, not orthodoxy, as now it is current that even some of the ulama decides about the orthodoxy. The sound teachings of Islam are the concern of people who are not primarily jurists, though typically they are also experts in jurisprudence. Nor can orthodoxy be limited to the views of the proponents of kalam, dogmatic theology. There are other ways to investigate the underlying teachings of Islam that have at least as much claim as Ash'arite kalam to orthodoxy. Moreover, kalam does not engage in speculation on the nature of reality in terms that can be enlightening for the questions such as gender relationships. Its fundamental concern is to support the authority of the Quran as a source of commandments. Ultimately, it has the Sharia in view, not the nature of reality itself. There are basic questions about gender that only the representatives of the Sufi intellectual vision had the resources to deal with. Questions such as how are male and female related to the structure of the natural world? What are the theological roots of gender distinctions? Is God primarily father or mother or both or neither? What is in the nature of existence itself that manifests itself as sexual distinctions? Are these distinctions essential to the nature of reality or peripheral? Can we ignore gender distinctions? Questions such as these, how can the Sharia answer, or the dogmatic theology, kalam? These questions cannot be addressed on the level of Sharia, which simply presents human beings with a list of does and doesn't. Nor can they be addressed by kalam, which is locked into an approach that places God, the king and commander, a close associate of God, the Father, at the top of its concerns. But that can be addressed and are addressed by the intellectual Sufi tradition, which is interested in the structure of reality as it presents itself to us. I should mention the book by Sachiko Murato, The Tao of Islam, who deals with really deeply with this problem of gender relationship in Islam. After raising the question of orthodoxy and rationality of Sufism from the jurisprudential point of view, now I want to continue the same discussion more in detail from the theological point of view. In this case, we are concerned with the problems such as the relation between God and the world. In Islamic terms, the world or cosmos, al-alam, can be defined as everything other than God. Especially in the later intellectual Sufi tradition, nothing is discussed independently from its relationship with God. It is the relationship that sets up a perspective in terms of which right understanding can be achieved. But there are always two fundamental relationships, radically different yet polar, since God is a single reality. In one respect, God is infinitely beyond the cosmos. Here the theological term is tanzih. It's a famous name. You can see it in all the Kalami books, which means to declare God incomparable with everything that exists. From this point of view, God is completely inaccessible to his creatures and beyond their understanding. This is the classical position of dogmatic theology in Islam Kalam. Many verses of the Quran could be cited to show that the Quran takes this point of view, such as Glory be to God, the Lord of inaccessibility, above everything that they describe. Or in simpler terms, nothing is like He, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ. In this respect, God is an impersonal reality far beyond human concerns. He is the God of certain form of negative theology. The point here is simply that dogmatic theologians, with their almost exclusive emphasis upon God's incomparability, tanzih, represented only a small number of intellectuals who had relatively little influence on the community at large. Popular Islam, the philosophical tradition, and the spiritual Sufi tradition stressed, or at least found ample room for a second point of view that is clearly supported by many Quranic verses. Both of them cite from Quran, different verses. The God of the theologians, as Ibn al-Arabi remarked, was a God whom no one could possibly love, since he was too remote and incomprehensible. But the God of Quran, the Prophet, and the spiritual authorities is a God who is supremely lovable, since he is dominated by concern for his creatures. As the Quran puts it, he loves them and they love him. يُحِبُّهُمْ وَيُحِبُّونَهُ. God's love for creation brings about love for God in the creatures. This God of compassion and love can be grasped and understood. To use the theological term, he must be declared similar. Tashbih. The words tashbih and tanzih are in contrast with each other. He must be declared similar, tashbih, in some fashion to his creation. We can rightly conceive of him in human attributes. This is the point of view of God's immanence in all things, and it is clearly supported by such Quranic verses as, whenever you turn, there is the face of God. فَأَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. And the other verse, and we are nearer to the human being than the jugular vein. نَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. These two top basic theological perspectives form two poles between which Islamic thought takes place. The most sophisticated of the Muslim thinkers strike a delicate balance between the two positions. Both negative and positive theology are needed to bring about a right understanding of the divine reality, a right understanding of Tawheed in Islam. This is the position of the Sufi masters such as Ibn Arabi in his Fusus al-Hikam in the chapter 3, the wisdom of exaltation in the word of Nuh. فَسُّ حِكْمَةٍ سُبُّوهِيَّةٍ فِي كَلِمَةٍ نُوحٍ.